Margaret Evans had spent decades climbing the ranks of corporate America, a journey marked by resilience and quiet determination. At 58, she'd just been appointed CEO of Horizon Innovations, a thriving, renewable energy company known for its cutting-edge technology and ambitious goals. But before she officially stepped into her role, Margaret had one priority: to understand the heart of the company she was about to lead. She wasn't interested in glossy reports or polished presentations. She wanted to see the unvarnished truth about how her people, especially her managers, treated those they thought no one was watching. Margaret knew from experience that a company's culture wasn't defined by its mission statement but by the everyday actions of its leaders. She'd faced her own share of bias over the years, whispers about her age, her gender, her unassuming demeanor, and she'd learned to spot it in others. So, she devised a plan. She wouldn't arrive at Horizon Innovations as Margaret Evans, CEO. Instead, she'd come as Ellen Carter, a 60-year-old widow applying for an entry-level administrative assistant position. To test the company's values further, she'd present herself with a cane, feigning a slight limp, a subtle challenge to see how people responded to perceived vulnerability. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when Margaret arrived at Horizon's sleek headquarters in downtown Chicago. The lobby buzzed with energy as candidates shuffled in for the company's biannual hiring event. Dressed in a modest gray skirt and blouse, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, Margaret blended into the crowd of hopefuls clutching resumes and practicing smiles. She leaned on her cane, moving slowly toward the check-in desk, her sharp eyes taking in every detail: the polished floors, the modern art on the walls, and the HR team members milling about with clipboards and practiced nods. At the desk, a young assistant glanced up at her. "Name?" he asked, barely looking up from his tablet. "Ellen Carter," Margaret replied, her voice soft but steady. She handed over a carefully crafted resume, one that listed plausible but modest experience. Clerical work, a few years at a small nonprofit, nothing flashy. The assistant tapped his screen, then handed her a name tag. "Wait over there," he said, pointing to a row of chairs where other candidates sat, fidgeting or scrolling on their phones. Margaret nodded and made her way over, easing herself into a seat with a slight wince. Part of the act, but convincing nonetheless. As she waited, she observed the HR team. They moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, calling names, exchanging quick pleasantries, and ushering candidates into interview rooms. But one manager stood out: Paul Grayson, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with a confident stride and a voice that carried across the room. He wore a tailored suit and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Margaret had read his file: head of recruitment, 10 years with Horizon, a reputation for results. She watched him closely as he worked the room, sizing up candidates with a glance. "Ellen Carter?" Paul's voice broke her thoughts. He stood a few feet away, clipboard in hand, scanning the waiting area. Margaret raised her hand slightly and began to stand, leaning on her cane for support. Paul's eyes landed on her and his expression shifted, just for a moment, but she caught it. A flicker of surprise, then something harder. He approached, stopping a little too far away to offer a handshake. "You're here for the administrative assistant role?" he asked, his tone clipped, as if confirming a fact he already doubted. "Yes, sir," Margaret said, meeting his gaze with a polite smile. "I'm excited to be here." Paul didn't return the smile. He glanced at her cane, then back at her face, his brow furrowing slightly. "Right. Follow me." He turned and walked toward an interview room, not slowing his pace. Margaret followed, her cane tapping softly against the floor, forcing herself to keep up despite the deliberate briskness of his stride. Inside the small room, Paul gestured to a chair across from a sleek desk. "Sit," he said, dropping into his own seat and flipping open her resume. Margaret settled in, resting her cane against the armrest, and waited. The silence stretched as Paul skimmed the page, his lips pursing. "So, Ellen," he began, leaning back in his chair, You've got, what, a few years of filing papers at some charity? That's it?" His tone carried a hint of mockery, subtle but unmistakable. Margaret nodded, unfazed. "Yes, and some bookkeeping. I'm organized, reliable, and I learn quickly." Paul smirked, tapping his pen against the desk. "Organized? Sure. But this job, it's not just shuffling papers. We move fast here. Deadlines, multitasking, pressure. You think you can handle that?" His eyes flicked to her cane again, lingering a beat too long. "I've handled plenty in my life," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm confident I can meet the demands." Paul let out a short, dry laugh. "Confidence is great, Ellen, but let's be real. Horizon's a high-performance environment. We need people who can keep up, physically, mentally. No offense, but I'm not sure you fit the bill." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "Look, I'll be straight with you. This isn't a retirement gig. Maybe you'd be better off somewhere." Slower. Margaret's expression didn't waver, though inside her mind raced. She noted the condescension, the assumptions baked into his words. "I appreciate your candor," she said evenly, "but I'd like the chance to prove myself." Paul shrugged, already closing her file. "I don't think that's necessary. We've got a lot of candidates. Younger, more agile. No point wasting your time, or mine." He stood, signaling the end of the interview. "Good luck out there." Margaret rose slowly, gripping her cane. She glanced around the room, catching the eyes of another HR staffer peering through the glass door. The woman looked away quickly, pretending not to notice. No one intervened. With a polite nod, Margaret left the room, her cane echoing in the hallway as she headed for the exit. But she wasn't leaving. Not yet. She'd seen enough. That afternoon, Margaret sat in her new corner office on the top floor, the cane tucked away in a closet. Dressed in a crisp navy suit, her silver hair now elegantly styled, she looked every inch the CEO. Paul Grayson's words replayed in her mind, along with the indifference of his team. She'd hoped to find a culture of fairness at Horizon, but what she'd encountered was a reminder of how easily prejudice could fester, even in a place that prided itself on progress. Her assistant, Priya, knocked and poked her head in. "Ready for the staff meeting, ma'am?" Margaret smiled. "Absolutely. Let's go." The company-wide meeting was held in the main conference hall, a cavernous space packed with employees eager to meet their new leader. Paul and his HR team sat near the front, chatting casually. None of them had any inkling of what was coming. The company's founder, Richard Holt, took the stage first. A wiry man in his late 60s, he'd built Horizon from a garage startup into an industry leader. Now, he was passing the torch to Margaret, his longtime friend and confidant. "Today," Richard began, "I'm proud to introduce the new CEO of Horizon Innovations. She's a woman of principle, someone who believes in people and in doing what's right. Please welcome Margaret Evans." The room erupted in applause as Margaret stepped forward, her presence commanding yet warm. Paul clapped along, his expression neutral, until she reached the podium and he saw her face. His jaw tightened, recognition dawning as he connected the dots. The woman he'd dismissed as Ellen Carter stood before him now, transformed but unmistakable. "Thank you, Richard," Margaret said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm honored to lead Horizon Innovations. But before we look to the future, I want to talk about the present, about who we are as a company." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, lingering briefly on Paul. "This morning, I experienced our hiring process firsthand. I came here not as your CEO, but as a candidate, someone seeking a chance to contribute. What I found was disappointing." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Paul shifted in his seat, his hands clenching the armrests. Margaret continued, her tone firm but measured. "I was met with assumptions about my abilities, judgments based not on my skills, but on my appearance and age. I was told this company wasn't for someone like me, and no one stepped in to challenge that. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Horizon is about innovation, she went on, but true innovation starts with how we treat people. Respect, fairness, inclusion. These aren't just buzzwords. They're the foundation of who we must be. If we can't offer that to every person who walks through our doors, we've failed. She glanced at Paul again, his face pale. To those who uphold these values, I'm excited to work with you. To those who don't, I urge you to reflect, because there's no place here for bias or disrespect. Richard joined her on stage, nodding in agreement. Margaret has my full support, he said. Paul Grayson, please see us after this meeting. The applause that followed was tentative at first, then grew stronger as employees processed her message. Paul sat frozen, the reality sinking in. Later, in Richard's office, Paul stood before Margaret and Richard, his usual confidence replaced by nervous fidgeting. I didn't mean to offend anyone, he stammered. I was just trying to protect the company's standards. Margaret folded her hands. Standards don't mean excluding people based on assumptions, Paul. You didn't give Ellen Carter a chance. You dismissed her outright. That's not protection. That's prejudice. Richard leaned forward. We've decided to let you go, Paul. This isn't about one mistake. It's about a pattern we can't ignore. Paul's shoulders slumped, and after a moment he nodded and left without another word. The door closed behind him, and Richard turned to Margaret. You're off to a strong start. She smiled faintly. It's not about me, Richard. It's about building a place where everyone gets a fair shot. In the weeks that followed, Margaret rolled out training programs and policies to reinforce Horizon's values. The story of Ellen Carter spread among the staff, becoming a quiet legend, a reminder that integrity started at the top. For Margaret, it wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about a lesson she'd learned long ago. True leadership meant seeing people for who they could be, not just who they appeared to be. And at Horizon Innovations, that lesson took root, one fair chance at a time. One small test revealed a truth that changed everything. This story reminds us that fairness and respect aren't just words. They're the foundation of a life well lived. If Margaret's journey inspired you, give this video a like to let us know. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that make you think and feel. What would you do if you had the chance to reshape a culture? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep in mind, true strength lies in lifting others up.